controversy surrounding SNC-Lavalin and alleged political interference in the company's bribery trial is now the subject of an ethics investigation. Today, the ethics watchdog launched a probe following a request from the opposition. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he welcomes it, again denying that he or anyone in his office directed his former Justice Minister to seek a plea deal and avoid a criminal trial for SNC-Lavalin. The CBC's David Cochrane is here to break it all down for us because we heard from the Prime Minister today, Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh. So let's start with the Prime Minister. What did he have to say?
Yeah, the Prime Minister, on questions about his reaction to the Ethics Commissioner's examination investigation, he says he welcomes the Ethics Commissioner's investigation. Talking to people in his office, they feel that it will clear them, but welcoming the investigation of the Ethics Commissioner is something this government has said a little bit too often, probably for their liking in an election year, because you go back to the Aga Khan Island vacation, you go back to Bill Morneau and the failure to disclose the corporate ownership of a villa in France, not a village, and also Dominic LeBlanc was sanctioned for his handling of a surf clam quota, which was taken away from a plant in Newfoundland and Labrador and given to a company with family connections in New Brunswick. So here we go again with this one. But he also said today that he has spoken with Jody Wilson-Raybould twice in the last 24 hours. He was in Vancouver today. He spoke with her for about 30 minutes when he got there yesterday, I'm told, and again for about 45 minutes this morning. And it was in that conversation that the Prime Minister says his former Attorney General reminded him of a conversation they had about SNC-Lavalin earlier this year. Here's what he said.
I have met with Minister Wilson-Raybould a couple of times already since arriving in BC yesterday. We spoke about our shared goals for our country and for this government. She confirmed for me a conversation we had this fall where I told her directly that any decisions on matters involving the Director of Public Prosecutions were hers alone. I respect her view that due to privilege, she cannot comment or add on matters recently before the media. And I also highlight that we're bound by cabinet confidentiality.
Okay, so there Trudeau talks about a conversation he had with Jody Wilson-Raybould last year. I'm told that this happened in the weeks prior to the federal prosecutors telling SNC-Lavalin, we will not be cutting this deal with you. You will not get a deferred prosecution agreement. And the question we had was, why did he feel the need to reassure her if he denies all the allegations in the Globe and Mail reporting last week that she was under pressure from his office? The explanation I have been given by a senior government official is that it was the climate of pressure. SNC-Lavalin ferociously lobbying everyone from MPs to the clerk to the ambassador to the U.S. to the Prime Minister's office, and they wanted to reassure Jody Wilson-Raybould that despite all the people paying attention to this and putting forward their opinion on this, that it was her decision alone. They insist adamantly that it was not anything to do with any pressure from the Prime Minister's office itself.
How is Andrew Scheer responding to all that?
Well, he kind of scoffed at the Prime Minister's welcoming of the Ethics Committee's investigation because, again, he makes a point, he referenced that track record that I talked about, that there have been a series of investigations into the conduct of top government officials, and it hasn't gone well. Here's what Scheer said today in New Brunswick.
This is the same Prime Minister who said there was nothing wrong with his illegal vacation. There was nothing wrong with having a minister hand out special contracts to family members. So I don't, pardon me if I don't take Justin Trudeau at his word. I think it's time, we heard today Justin Trudeau said that he spoke to Jody Wilson-Raybould and he reported on the nature of those conversations. I think it's time for Justin Trudeau to stop speaking for Jody Wilson-Raybould and let her speak for herself.
I think a lot of people covering this might agree with that last statement that we'd all like to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould. She has not spoken to anybody today, notably not present with the Prime Minister today at the announcement he made in Vancouver, even though other cabinet ministers and MPs were. It's even difficult to get statements corroborating things like the Prime Minister, not to say he isn't telling the truth, but when he says, I spoke to her and she reminded me of this conversation, I've reached out to her off, say, can you just confirm that that is in fact what happened in the meeting, that in her conversation today? I haven't heard anything back.
Silence. Okay, what about NDP leader Jagmeet Singh?
Yeah, they're having a pretty good day because Nathan Cullen and Charlie Angus wrote the Ethics Commissioner, said, hey, can you look into this? And they got a positive response, maybe not on the terms that they wanted, but under other terms, Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. They're joining the Conservatives in the call for getting this before the Justice Committee and calling on the government to waive its solicitor-client privilege to allow Jody Wilson-Raybould and everyone else to speak publicly. Here's what Jagmeet Singh said today.
We want the government to go beyond that. We want them to waive solicitor-client privilege. We want the government and Mr. Trudeau to allow the Justice Committee to ask questions about what's going on, because at the end of the day, we've got a multinational corporation that's pressured this government to change the laws, to create a loophole so they don't actually face criminal sanction.
So he's happy with the decision by the Ethics Commissioner, but like the Conservatives, they want this to go before the Justice Committee, and they've also got some Liberal support on this. Wayne Long, a New Brunswick member of Parliament, a Liberal, said he would like to see the Justice Committee go ahead with this. As for the question of waiving solicitor-client privilege, the Prime Minister has asked the new Attorney General, David Lametti, to give him some advice on that. David Lametti was asked about this many times today, and he gave us a litany of no comment in both official languages. So we have no answer in English and no answer in French. We're just going to have to wait and see where that goes.
Okay, thanks, David. The CBC's David Cochran. So should these allegations and the people associated with them go before the Justice Committee? Quebec Liberal MP Anthony Housefather chairs the House Justice Committee, and he joins me now via Skype from Montreal. Hi, Mr. Housefather. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Vashi. Great to be with you.
So we learned today that the Ethics Commissioner believes this is worth investigation or examination. Will the Justice Committee be looking into this?
Well, I've convened a meeting for Wednesday of all of the members of the Justice Committee at the request of the Conservative and NDP members, and we will look into whether or not we would be helpful in the process. I have said from the beginning that I am open to the idea, provided that we find that a partisan House committee is a good vehicle to get answers, as opposed to being the show that question period is. For example, Vashi, the Conservative and NDP member on the committee put forward a motion without consulting any of the Liberal members. We heard from the call for a meeting from the Leader of the Opposition at a press conference and not in dialogue with us. So part of my concern relates to, will the committee look at it appropriately in a way that is nonpartisan and helps the Canadian people further their understanding of this issue and hopefully clarifies matters? Or will it become a question period exercise, which would be useless?
How are you going to define that, though? You're using the word appropriate. I mean, you are coming at it, though you're the chair of the committee, from your own partisan slant as well. So
yes.
how will you define what is appropriate?
Well, so that's exactly the point, right? A House committee, by definition, is partisan. The Liberals on the committee are predisposed to believe the Prime Minister, to believe that there's nothing there. The Conservatives and the NDP on the committee would be hopeful that there would be something there to help them in the election. So the question then is a House committee an appropriate vehicle? But our Justice
It sounds like you think it already isn't, though.
Well, then the question is there a better vehicle?
What would
right?
that be?
Because, well, that's my question. Canadians deserve answers on this. I believe the Prime Minister, but I know that there's a lot of Canadians out there that aren't prepared to simply take the Prime Minister's word for this. And if we're able to shed light on these allegations in a helpful, nonpartisan way, if we can find a way to do that, then I'm not close to the idea. That's what my colleagues and I need to ponder over the next couple of days. I'm listening to a lot of people talk to me about it, and we'd have to find a way to agree on terms that would be helpful to get answers for Canadians, as opposed to having people try to score political points at the committee.
I mean, but to be honest, I've been to many of these types of committee meetings. You have the ability as parliamentarians to call these figures who we normally would not be able to hear from as Canadians. Yes, there are partisan back and forth, but normally you actually get a lot of answers in committee. I've been to many committees where you do get answers. So I don't know what better vehicle, like what other vehicle is there to compel people like Michael Wernick to talk before parliamentarians. I don't know what other vehicle might be available to you.
So again, that's what I'm considering. The first thing is that ministers are not compellable. Ministers will come if they want. We can't force them to come. And I think the real key here, of course, is Jody Wilson-Raybould and what she has to say, because I think that's what Canadians are really waiting to hear. But that being said, I think our committee, as opposed to question period, has achieved a lot of great things by working together. I mean, brought forward great proposals to reinstate court challenges program, brought forward a great report on how to improve things for jurors in Canada. We have shown the ability to work together, which is why I'm questioning the way the Conservatives and the NDP, in this case, acted very partisanly by putting forward a motion where they didn't consult with the Liberals and didn't even advise us they wanted to call a meeting, when I've never refused to call a meeting of the committee when they've requested it. So I'm starting from a
But you did get the request, to be fair. I mean, they did make the request. They've been asked about it publicly. The story is a big story. They're being asked about it in the media.
Yeah, but normally a request comes, the members of the committee talk to one another, and they say, we'd like to call a meeting. And I've never had a problem calling a meeting. I don't hear about it in an Andrew Scheer press conference. Normally, we work together on motions and we talk to each other about whether or not we're going to agree or find common ground. In this case, we didn't have any input into the motion they're putting forward. Now, of course, we can amend it.
So are you saying, though, that if the motion were worded differently, that you might be more apt to support it? I'm just trying to, what are you trying to get at here?
I'm trying to start from the premise that this started in a partisan way. It didn't start the normal way Justice Committee stuff starts, which is nonpartisan. But I'm open to amending the motion. I'm open to looking at all avenues. I am not closed to this because I understand that Canadians want answers. I believe the Prime Minister. I think these are unnamed sources with no names to them that are making allegations that a standard was violated. And at any time that standard is violated, the Attorney General would resign. In this case, not only did she not resign, she's still in cabinet. But I also
But she's not coming out and saying that that didn't happen.
Right. I also understand that Canadians are confused as to why Minister Lametti is saying on the record that this didn't happen, and Minister Wilson-Raybould is not. And
are you asking questions, or do you have confusion about that? Because I think Canadians are wondering why one set of rules applies to one AG and not the other.
Yeah, I think all Canadians are asking that, and I think you could think that Liberal MPs are normal Canadians, listening to our caucus fellow caucus members and listening to Canadians, and I think that is a question, and I think that's why if she came forward, right, this study would be useless. So that's the real question, and I hope. I hope over the next couple of days she'll come forward and just acknowledge exactly what Mr. Lametti has said and what the Prime Minister has said, is that there was no undue pressure or direction given to her in this case. That would put an end to it.
So you think she should be coming forward because she has made the point, the Minister has made the point that she doesn't want to make a comment because of solicitor-client privilege. Do you not agree with that argument? Do you think that should be waived? What is it? I
think solicitor-client privilege is incredibly important. I don't pretend to have the background or knowledge that the Department of Justice can have when they advise Minister Lametti. My only comment is one that I've made before, is that Minister Lametti has answered that very question of whether or not there was direction or pressure put upon him. And if he can answer that question without waiving privilege as to other matters, why can't Minister Wilson-Raybould?
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Housefather. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
As we've been discussing, the opposition is demanding this case be heard by the Justice Committee. The Conservatives are threatening to use legal tools if the government stonewalls them. What are those tools, and why isn't an ethics probe enough? Lisa Raitt is the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party and joins us now from Fredericton, and Nathan Collin is NDP Democratic Reform Critic with me here in Ottawa. Hi to both of you. Great to see you. I really appreciate your time. Ms. Raitt, I'll start with you, and I want to pick up first on what we just discussed with Mr. Housefather. He seemed to really be fixated on the idea of whether or not the committee this week will be partisan in the way in which they look at this issue, whether in deciding if they should investigate or not, or they should call people to testify before a committee. What do you make of what he said?
I don't understand what he's trying to get at, Vashi, to be honest. I did listen intently, trying to understand what the chair had to say, because obviously the chair is going to set the standard on Wednesday that I'm going to have to argue to in order to convince the people around the table that we should indeed have a study at the Justice Committee. And I think we've got a lot of evidence as to why we should. Now, if he's going to talk about the process by which it happened, he's missing the whole point. I mean, the whole point of this is there is an ethics investigation that's going to happen. Congratulations to Nathan and Charlie and the NDP for bringing that forward. And the other point is that this just gets murkier by the minute. I mean, I listened to the Prime Minister this afternoon, and I'm even more confused than ever about what conversations happened at what time. Why did the Prime Minister feel the need to assure his minister that there was no pressure on her? Was there pressure on her? Let's just get to the bottom of it all and figure out what's happening.
Does he have a point, Ms. Raitt, when he says that the way in which, I mean, I know you said the process is does he have a point in basically saying that the process was partisan right from the beginning, that this didn't happen the quote-unquote normal way that this kind of a committee question would be looked at?
Do you think it's normal to have the allegations that the Prime Minister's office interfered with a criminal investigation by pressuring the Attorney General? I don't think that's normal. And I think the fact that we reacted so quickly is because it goes to the heart of what our justice system is all about. Now, if Anthony wants to call this as being partisan in nature, I would not say it's partisan in nature. I think it's getting out there and defending the interests of the Canadian public as soon as we possibly could. And that's what we did. Now we'll talk about it on Wednesday. But I'll tell you something. I don't think Canadians will be impressed that the Liberals decide because it's too partisan that they're not going to take a look at this issue. Canadians want to know what exactly is going on between the Prime Minister's office and these other entities that are carrying out our justice.
Mr. Cullen, your response to that same criticism from Mr. Housefather, basically that this started in a partisan way and that his concern for it being not the best vehicle because of partisanship?
I'm a bit confused and more than a bit disappointed with what I just heard. Because let's start with what the accusations are, the alleged incursion, which is somebody from the Prime Minister's office went to the Attorney General's office and put pressure on the Attorney General to get a plea deal for a large multinational corporation so that they could avoid sentencing, which would have prevented them from bidding on massive, lucrative government contracts. That's the case that we're starting with. We also would love to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould. And you know who has the power to do that? Justin Trudeau, where he simply says to her, I waive solicitor-client privilege. You can speak about the conversations you had with regard to SNC-Lavalin and what you saw those conversations as, and we clear this up.
He said he's consulting with David Lametti,
Yeah, I'm
the
sure
new
he's
AG on
sure,
that issue.
yeah, and so the new AG, as did Mr. Housefather right now, says, we're not going to interfere with what's happening at the committee, but we think there's nothing to see here. And when you ask the new Attorney General, did you ask the old Attorney General, did anything happen? He says, I've never spoken to her about it. Maybe making him the least curious Attorney General in Canadian history. Because if there has been an obstruction of justice at the Attorney General's office, from a government who claims that the courts need to be respected and the rule of law is paramount for this government and this country, to then have that allegation sitting there and the current Attorney General, without asking the principal person involved what happened, I don't see anything to investigate. I heard the Prime Minister use one distinct word over and over again, and that's enough for me as the top prosecutor in Canada is giving me even more concern. Look, Liberals should be interested in getting to the bottom of what happened. The way that we do that is we invite the people in front of committee, and I've seen this committee and many other House of Commons committees work together to get stuff done on behalf of Canadians. Hear from the Principal Secretary of the Prime Minister, hear from the Clerk of the Privy Council. What is your version of events? Did you feel like you put pressure on the Attorney General? They can tell us whatever they'd like, and then we can get to the bottom of this and know that either clear the way or find out that there's more involved.
To play devil's advocate, Ms. Ray, the Prime Minister said today he does welcome the ethics investigation. Would that be enough to satisfy the questions that both you and Mr. Cullen are raising?
Of course not.
Why not?
Because we need to hear from the witnesses in an open fashion as to exactly what happened. I mean, this came to light on the front page of the Globe and Mail. Canadians are now engaged in the issue, like it or not. There was cover-to-cover coverage all weekend on this particular issue, and constituents want to know what happened. The best way to do it is to have it, as Nathan said, in front of this Justice Committee where people can come in and tell us what happened, instead of behind the scenes with the Ethics Commissioner, which will take 18 months, quite frankly, and we don't get to see what the witnesses have to say. I think, you know, a little bit of sunshine on this is going to be the best disinfectant, and this is the best way to do it.
This is the government that, when they came into office, said they would be open by default. They'd be the most transparent government in Canadian history. And as we go through what is, everybody agrees, these allegations are serious. They're not substantiated yet, and that's what we're trying to do. The Ethics Commissioner can look at one very small part of the act and as to whether a third party was influenced, but you've seen his rulings before. It's more public shaming than it is there's a small financial penalty when he found Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Morneau, and Dominic LeBlanc guilty of breaking the ethics code. That's important and fine for us all to be held to that account, and those three were found guilty in those cases. But the fine is incremental and not very large. The Justice Committee can look at this properly, and I'd appeal to Mr. Housefather and the Liberals on that committee. We're sent here to do a job on behalf of Canadians. Corruption starts and is allowed to flourish when we're not holding government to account. And to simply say, oh, this is all a partisan activity,
well,
we
to
should
be
all
fair,
just
he
turn
didn't
away.
say it all was. He did say he had questions.
Well, so then,
too.
then work with us, right? Because we're going to make a very straight presentation. These are the facts as we know them. These are the people we would like to hear from. And when Liberals were looking into the Wright Duffy affair in the last government, they were just as keen as we are right now to find out what exactly happened in a case that was very suspicious to Canadians and proved to be of some substance. And last thing, Vashi, is the letter we got from the Ethics Commissioner this morning. People are worried that there's stamped confidential on it. We checked with the Ethics Commissioner's office before we made that public. Their Commissioner's office said you're allowed to make this public, and then we did. We think more light on this, not less, is important, and allow him to do his investigation, and we can work in tandem. None of this, well, this is under an investigation, we can't talk about it. This is before the courts. We got to find out what happened here. I think it's important to Canadians.
Last question for you, Ms. Wright. The Prime Minister also said today, basically, that his office had heard from other MPs, premiers, and premiers about the importance of SNC. Are those legitimate concerns that could have prompted conversations about the file?
Not according to what's in the Act. According to what's in the Act, that's the legislation that was slipped into the Budget Omnibus Bill, is that the prosecutor is not to take economic interests into consideration when they make their decision. She didn't. They're arguing that in court right now. I think it's telling that the prosecutor actually said that she needs to be free from political interference in her decision making, and the court's going to make a judgment there. Also happening in court, though, too, Vashi, and it's reported on CBC, is the fact that there's another allegation that there's political interference in the case of the Mark Norman trial, and we're going to be following that as well. We've been following it very carefully, but now another allegation of PCO being in the room having a discussion on trial strategy with the prosecutors when PCO is the individual or the entity that's choosing which documents are going to be released to Mark Norman. It just doesn't make, like, who's in charge?
We'll have Murray Brewster on
This isn't about jobs. This was about a large multinational lobbying this government more than 50 times the last 18 months for this change, which they got. And then the Prime Minister's office may have asked the AG to give them a plea deal. When she refused, she seems to have been dismissed. There's not been alleged. Well, we don't have any other reason why he fired his Attorney General and his Justice Minister.
Well, he moved her to a different portfolio.
Right, but she was doing a good job. And he says she was doing a wonderful job. We're just getting rid of her in the next 9 months. And all these dots line up, and Liberals see nothing, whereas Canadians say it seems to be painting a picture that should cause all of us concern, even Liberals on that Justice Committee.
We'll have to watch that Justice Committee meeting on Wednesday. Thank you very much to both of you. Thanks to Lisa Raitt and Nathan Cullen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe that it's extremely important that Canadians can continue to have confidence in our system, and that's why I welcome the Ethics Commissioner's interest in this matter. It's also why I have asked the Justice Minister to look in and to make recommendations to me on the complex matter of solicitor-client privilege.
The controversy surrounding SNC-Lavalin and alleged political interference in the company's bribery trial is now the subject of an ethics investigation. Today, the ethics watchdog launched a probe following a request from the opposition. Here's a quick summary of the allegations involving the PMO, former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, and SNC-Lavalin. The Montreal firm is Canada's largest engineering and construction company, and it faces what's been described as the greatest case of corruption fraud in Canadian history. It's alleged that between 2001 and 2011, SNC bribed public officials in Libya with millions of dollars in order to secure government contracts there. The RCMP laid charges in 2015. Today, SNC argues those responsible are no longer working for the company, and it has beefed up its ethics and compliance rules. That's why SNC has been pushing for a DPA, a deferred prosecution agreement, instead. This option became available back in September. It's kind of like a plea bargain. Charges are dropped if the accused, say, admits to wrongdoing or pays a big fine or cooperates with authorities. But the Globe and Mail reports that in October, Canada's Director of Public Prosecutions shut the door on SNC's request for a DPA. That's when officials from Justin Trudeau's office allegedly turned to Jody Wilson-Raybould, then Justice Minister, who reportedly refused to pressure the prosecution office to change its mind. In January, Wilson-Raybould was shuffled out of her cabinet position. So how often do cases like this come up in the Prime Minister's office, and who's involved in those discussions? Mel Kapp is the former clerk of the Privy Council and currently teaches at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Hi, Mr. Kapp. Great to see you. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Vashi.
I'll start just right at the very sort of basic level of all this. Can you help our viewers understand, for those who don't know, what exactly the clerk of the Privy Council does? Like, what is the basic function?
There are really 2 or 3 hats that the clerk wears. There's the clerk of the Privy Council, which is like the deputy minister to the Prime Minister. There's secretary to cabinet, which is an accountability to the entire cabinet. And there's head of the public service. All 3 functions are combined under one person, into one person.
And how much authority does, for example, the clerk have versus staff in the Prime Minister's office versus actual ministers?
So the clerk has a few functions that are actually statutory and specified in law, but by and large, the clerk speaks with the voice of the Prime Minister, and that it depends on the clerk and on the Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister confides and confers power and authority on the clerk, then the clerk can speak with the Prime Minister's voice. If the Prime Minister merely uses the clerk as an advisor, then the clerk will merely speak to the Prime Minister. But in my experience, and certainly the way it appears to me now, the Prime Minister and the clerk have a partnership in effect. And so the clerk speaks on behalf of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister may ask the clerk to speak on his behalf to ministers, deputy ministers, or the public.
Does it just depend on the Prime Minister, or does it depend on the situation? So, for example, could there be a situation in which the clerk was speaking very much on behalf of the Prime Minister and others where they were not?
Of course. And it is the judgment of everyone whether the clerk is speaking on the Prime Minister's behalf or not. But the clerk never speaks in such a manner that it would allow for someone not to understand that it was on behalf of the Prime Minister. It is understood by every clerk I've known that when they speak, the danger is, if it's not a power, that they will actually be interpreted as speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister.
So in that case, then, are they, when you say the understanding is of everyone, who sort of establishes in what capacity? Is it the clerk that says, I'm talking to you in this respect on this subject, or how does that work?
It could be. It really depends on the style of the clerk and on the style of the Prime Minister. But it would be very normal for the Prime Minister to say, I've asked the clerk to do this, and he would tell the cabinet that, or a particular minister that, or he would ask the clerk to go and speak to a minister on his behalf. When I was clerk, I had many a minister come and talk to me about how they had got the Prime Minister to agree with them about something. Most often, we had a little line that was that they must have whispered in the Prime Minister's right ear. Prime Minister Chrétien was deaf in his right ear.
So that was actually what I wanted to follow up with. So you're saying that it would not be unusual for the clerk to speak to ministers. Would that be something that regularly happens? Would it be at the direction of the Prime Minister, or again, is that situationally dependent?
It's situationally dependent, but I would say that it was fairly regular occurrence. Every cabinet meeting, every Tuesday there'll be a cabinet meeting in the morning, and the Prime Minister will preside the meeting, but the clerk will be in the room and will use the occasion to do some business with other ministers, and vice versa. Ministers will approach the clerk to do some business with him, where they think that the clerk will undoubtedly convey those views to the Prime Minister.
And would those meetings happen on the side or on their own?
No, on the side, but there may be a pull aside. Someone may whisper in the clerk's ear, or vice versa. But that's the natural course of doing business. These are very personal relationships that are important to the functioning of government.
If a minister, for example, disagrees with a certain policy stance that the Prime Minister has taken or their staff has expressed, what actions can they take from where you sit?
It really depends on the circumstance. Some ministers will ask for a meeting with the Prime Minister. Some will speak to the clerk and say, you should tell the Prime Minister this. They might speak to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff or Principal Secretary and say, you should be aware of that. And there's a whole array of different instruments that ministers have, some of which would include a letter to the Prime Minister or a letter to someone. That would be a very formal way of dealing with it. You'd always want to signal in advance that you had a preoccupation or a concern. In your experience, were incidents like that mostly dealt with informally? Mostly informally, I would say, yes. But again, it depends. And it depends on whether you're dealing with the statutory function of a minister or their typical responsibilities as a cabinet minister in cabinet. And finally, do you believe that a clerk, for example, should, if called before a parliamentary committee, like in this case, for example, there's talk of calling the clerk before the Justice Committee. In your experience as clerk, would you feel it necessary to attend if that were to be the case? I was invited on several occasions to speak before parliamentary committees, in particular on what was then the Anti-Terrorism Act. I absolutely took the invitation seriously and did myself appear. I know other clerks have done so both before me and since. And it's a judgment call. If someone, there is a legitimate pushback by the clerk to say, sorry, that's a cabinet confidence and I won't deal with that issue. Mm-hmm. And so it's not for the clerk to disclose cabinet confidences, but neither is it for the clerk to refuse on principle that he should not appear. On the other hand, the Prime Minister might well want to stand in the way and say that the clerk is the wrong person to appear, that the minister is the one who's responsible and should deal with it.
Okay, we shall see. Thank you so much, Mr. Kapp. Appreciate your time and insight.
Thank you.